Here I am trying to keep this car running so I can stay alive, basically. Hey there, and welcome to Car Stories with Matt. When I was about 16, 17 years old and a little rural Saskatchewan town, I remember a car that was around locally, and I'd known of it for a few years but had never bumped into the owner or anything of it to talk to them about it. And that car was a 73 Mercury Comet 4-door. It was in a tan, like a beige color, and I really loved the lines of that car. I know 4-door and everything, but actually I love those old 4-doors from the 70s that have the muscle car type body lines to them. You know how muscle cars kind of hump up at the back in the quarter panel area, and they have that muscular look to them. Well, the Comet, even the 4-door, had that sort of lines to the back of it, and I really liked that. I mean, they're a good looking car from every angle. Basically a poor man's Mustang. And this car looked like it was a cream puff, basically, like an original car that was just, had a couple little spots of rust here and there on it, but it looked mostly like it was a fairly minty original car, and that it was just starting to break out in a few spots. And this was just a few months after my brother had just bought himself a 67 Ford Fairlane, and he bought it off of the original owner for only $2,000. And it had, new paint on it, but other than that, the car was original, one owner, and it was mint. It was like a survivor car, basically. And so I was a little jealous, and when I bought the Comet, that was what I had in mind, that I was getting a cool car like my brother had, kind of thing. And didn't really work out that way. My brother's car was a whole lot nicer, but at the time I thought this Comet was just as cool. And so it actually came to my parents' little restaurant one day. They had a little motel and 20-seat restaurant where they made really good home-cooked meals, and this old couple who drove the car came by for a bite to eat one day. And so I finally got to talk to them, and I literally asked them if they'd sell me the car, and they said they would. I think we even agreed on a price then, or maybe it was a bit later we agreed on it, but it was $1,500, which seemed like a really good deal. And so the only thing is they had to replace the car before they could give it to me, and I was pretty excited to take ownership of it. So it turned out their old car was sitting in their yard, an old Chevy Caprice, and they mentioned that it just needed a starter and they could actually drive it. So I went over on the weekend and helped the old guy put a starter in his Caprice and got it all running, and I was able to take my Comet home. I was working in a body shop at the time, so I started driving the car right away, and I remember when I drove it to work, the guys at work were saying, there's a lot more rust there than you think. I'm like, oh, no, it's just starting to break out, it'll be fine. And they're like, yeah, whatever. So anyways, home a few weekends later and decided to start doing some body repairs on the Comet. So take my little die grinder and start grinding one of those little rust spots out. Well, it starts taking the rust off, and next thing I know, right through the panel. And when I ended up grinding all the Bondo and rust out of there, yes, there was Bondo in it, I discovered that the whole car was full of Bondo, and that somebody had literally put old chunks of wood in behind and everything, and just Bondoed over it to rebuild this was behind the back wheel in the car, and I ended up with a hole like that big back there, and the whole car was like that. Like the boggins of all the doors were rotted out, and the boggins, the defenders, everything was just shot. But you know, I cut it all out and welded patches all in there and did all the body work, and that ended up being my first paint job, like with the proper spray gun and automotive paint and everything. And so there was a few errors that I made. One, I didn't have the paint mixed properly. I didn't have enough reducer in it, and so didn't go on quite right on the back of the car anyways, because I painted the back of the car first. And also I had done it in my parents' garage with it all sealed up, and so what happened is all the overspray built up in the air and settled back onto the paint, and so it wasn't all shiny because of that. So I discovered when I did the front panels that if you opened the door after spraying, all the overspray would vent out and it wouldn't settle back on the paint job. So the front panels turned out way nicer, and I should have probably redone the back after, but I didn't. I was anxious to drive it, so I just drove it like that, with the back of it kind of dull and the front of it kind of shiny. In fact, I had literally driven it around for a little while, even with no panels on the front, while I was working on the front panels, and had a lot of fun with that car. But anyways, I did succeed and get it all painted up. I ended up painting it lemon twist yellow, because one of the guys at work was redoing a Roadrunner, like a 68 Roadrunner at the time, and he did it in lemon twist yellow, and I thought it just looked great. It was the perfect color for a muscle car. So that's what I did, and I ended up keeping the car and driving it quite a bit after that. I ended up putting 15,000 miles on it actually, and driving it daily, and it was a lot of fun because you could really drift around and goof around in that car. It handled a lot like a Mustang, and especially in the winter time, I would slide it around all the corners and stuff and have a lot of fun with it. And I remember this one time in particular, I was working with this guy. He wasn't much older than me, and we had to drive across town in one of the company cars one day for whatever reason, and he was driving, and he really tried to scare me. It was all the roads were slippery, and he was going really fast and sliding all over the place. And so opportunity came about a week later to get him back, because I ended up having to pick him up in the Comet, in my Comet, on the other side of town, and I did the exact same thing, only I took it up a notch. And I remember I was doing, like, I was crazy back then, I was doing 70 miles an hour through the center of town on ice in this Comet, and this guy was just screaming and gripping the door handle, you know. And then we get back to work, and the parking lot at work was just like huge. We restored cars there, but there was an RV dealer out of the same building, and heavy truck repair, heavy mechanical repair. So our parking area was just huge, and it was all iced over at the time. So I came flying in there at like 40-50 miles an hour and just put her sideways into a spin. And I mean, I pretty well had the car figured out, and I would drift into my parking spot along the building between two other cars, and he was shaking pretty good by the time he got out of the car. I got him back, but good. And so yeah, I mean, I had a lot of fun with the car, but it had some negative drawbacks for sure, like the heater in it didn't work worth a darn. I used to have to drive with basically one hand over the defrost vent and the other on the steering wheel, and alternate back and forth to keep my hands thawed out in the winter. That was kind of how it was, and it also was really hard starting. It didn't want to start in the cold, and I remember the auto choke used to stick on all the time and stuff, so I ended up putting a manual one on it. That helped a little, but anyways, it was a really cold winter's day, and I ended up, I was no longer working at that other shop, and I had applied for work at this really cool body shop a long ways away, but they restored cars, and it was just like my dream job. And so I was, the Comet was my only car at the time, so I was going to drive up and go to this job, but it was middle of winter, and the day I picked was a terrible storm, and I should have gave my head a shake and rethought that, but I thought the storm was going to clear up through the course of the day, so I took off, and it was like 4 hours away. So I head up there, and it was pretty bad on the way, but you know, I could see the road and it's doing alright, but the problem was the car wasn't running too good. I didn't know exactly why. All I knew is it didn't want to idle, and you know, it was really bagging out when you're accelerating, and you'd have to almost like pump the gas to keep it running and stuff. I discovered later that the timing chain was actually loose and was jumping, and so it was out of time. But I made it to the interview regardless, and I guess I was pretty nervous about it, so I ended up forgetting my headlights on. I had my headlights on even though it was daytime, because there was a lot of blowing snow, like whiteout type conditions in the air. Visibility was really poor. So I went in, had a great interview, was pretty well convinced I got the job, and I go back out and the car won't start. The battery's dead. So the guys from the shop come out and boost it and start it, but it won't idle now. It won't even go into gear. So we ended up pushing it into their shop and warming it all up, and I'm fiddling with the carburetor and whatever, trying to make it look like I know what I'm doing, because I was trying to get this job, and I eventually got it running good enough to get it out the door and leave, so I didn't at least look like such an idiot in front of them. And my mum had been on the phone with me at one point while I was there, trying to convince me to stay put and just get a motel room, which would have been smart, but I knew that the car wasn't going to start in the morning. It was really cold out, and there was just no way. So I headed home, and remember, even when I stopped for gas, I left the car idling and just, you know, fueled it up and kept on going, but the car just kept running worse and worse and worse. And it got to the point where I was having to shift down to the lower gears, you know, 3-speed automatic, so I was putting it in like second gear. And then when the weather kept getting worse at the same time, this whiteout, if you've never been in a whiteout, like it's when the snow becomes airborne and it's like a sandstorm, only it's snow in the air. And this particular day was the worst I had ever seen, and it was to the point where I could no longer see the yellow line looking out the windshield of the car, like over the hood of the car. It was just, there was no visibility that was that far. And so here I am trying to keep this car running so I can stay alive, basically, because like if I stopped and the car died, or if I got stuck in the ditch or anything, nobody would have found me until morning. That's how bad this storm was. There was already cars all over in the ditch everywhere, but you know, most cars, you run them in the ditch and they keep on running. Mine was in such rough shape that day that I knew there was no way that I could keep the car running and keep the heater going through the night to keep from freezing to death. So my only option was to drive through the storm and get to somewhere. So that's what I was trying to do. I was looking out the side window literally to see the yellow line to keep on the road, and at times even having to open the door and look down at the road and see that yellow line. And I remember at one point I lost the road for a second, and I looked out the side window and actually saw the white line of the bicycle lane to the left of my car, and I knew that I was actually in the ditch. Although I couldn't see that, I was in the ditch, and I was going fast enough that I was able to slowly pull the car back onto the road. And that wasn't the worst of it though, because I caught up to a giant RV at some point. This was like a tour bus style RV, like a big diesel pusher RV. And he was going about 10 miles an hour, which made sense. But the problem is, when I tried to go 10 miles an hour, even in the lowest gear, the car wasn't revving enough. By this point, I was having to have the car just like revved out like 3,000-4,000 RPM to keep it running. And so what I was having to do following this RV is keep dropping it into neutral and revving it just to keep it running. And I knew I couldn't sustain that very long, so I actually pulled out and passed him, even though there was zero visibility. It's the scariest and most dangerous thing I've ever done in my whole driving career. But I put her to the boards, and I was doing about 70 miles an hour, just looking at the side of this RV for guidance as I shot past him, and just praying that there wasn't any oncoming cars, because I would have smoked him dead on and probably been dead. So I got by the RV and just kept on trucking. And I remember coming to this little sign, like a sign for a town, and it said, like, 2 kilometers ahead or whatever. And then I kept driving and I saw these lights, so I thought I had come to this little town site. But in rural Saskatchewan, a lot of towns have just been basically abandoned, like everybody just moves away. But they leave the signs and the markings there, and that's what this basically was. There was no town there, and so the lights I saw were just a farmhouse. And when I pulled in there and knocked on the door, I asked, "Is there a motel near here?" And they said, "No, there's nothing near here." They're like, you're going to have to come in and spend the night here with us. So this complete strangers took me into their home and fed me and gave me a place to sleep. I mean, that was amazing. That's really renews your faith in humanity when you have a experience like that. And then the next day in the cold, they came out and helped me try to get my car running, but that was unsuccessful. And so my parents ended up coming and picking me up. I was still like 2.5 hours from home at this point, and I actually left the car there for quite a while until my brother had time to drive me up, and we brought some parts, and we're working on the car there, trying to get it running and get it back home. But my mechanical experience back then wasn't what it is today, and I just really was over my head on figuring out what was going on with the car. So we never got it running good enough to get it out of there, and I ended up giving up on it, and actually put the car for sale back in my hometown for $25. And a guy that I knew down the road bought it for his daughter for her first car. They trailered it home and got it to the local garage, who got it running for them. And they used it for a couple years. Their daughter did. It was her first car, and I guess she had a lot of fun with it, but it was a little bit bittersweet for me to see it driving around, and I had some regrets for sure. It was still kind of a cool car, even though it was had seen some better days and it had a lot of rust in it still. But I really enjoyed owning that car, no matter what. It was an experience. Thanks a lot for watching Car Stories with Matt. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and have yourself a great day.